Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with Interfex 2017, presents Interfex Live.
Okay. So what we're going to be talking about are the regulations on drug supply chain security. We're going to start touching on that. Actually, we feel as a group it's so important we're going to be doing this twice. So yeah, I apologize on the delay now, and we're going to be doing it again this afternoon. I want to welcome Christa Myers from CRV and Carlos from SeaVision. We're going to be talking about trace and track and a whole bunch of stuff. So as you can see, we've been meticulously prepared here, so let me get started. So I just said we're going to do it twice today. So obviously this thing is pretty important, and we talk about it every year. So with serialization, I mean, what are the key regulatory requirements right now? Where are we at with this? I mean, where are we at? So Carlos, you want to start off?
So I guess the biggest concern right now is dealing with compliance. You know, item level serialization is probably the most important aspect for a lot of companies. However, companies are leaning towards aggregation as well to kind of do it as one bundled approach rather than dealing with the 2023 compliance relative to aggregation. I think really the regulations for the U.S. side haven't changed much. I think we understand what needs to be done. It's just a matter of doing it now.
Right.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I would agree. So, chain of custody is one of those things that it affects everything we do. It affects the way we design our facilities, from the way materials are brought into the warehouse to the way things are brought into the process suites and the process functionality of any of the drug product processing that we deal with. So every time that material changes hands, something has to be documented so that you can protect the drug supply and protect the quality of those compounds. Now we're finally seeing it move into the patient side of things, so down to that smallest unit dose. And we're seeing it affect the fill lines that we're designing, and we're seeing it affect the packaging lines that we're designing. So that type of information does nothing but protect the patient. So this is one of those things in the industry that's moving towards protecting each of us as patients.
Okay, I tell you what, why don't we do this? I had a question, actually. Considering we talk about this, I say, pretty much every year. So what have we learned? Let's be specific. Say, what have we learned from like 2015 to now? Pretty much, I mean, take your best shot at it.
So I think the funny thing to me is that what we've learned is that many of the companies that are trying to implement it have not been ready for it or have been surprised at the cost that affects them. So, in many ways, when it first started, even go back past 2015, when we started talking about serialization in the industry and started setting dates and deadlines, people were starting to get into it and start to look to it, and we all thought it was just a simple vision system. And now once people got into it, they realized exactly how complex the answers really are, and that there's a whole data background to it, and that data background and that tracking that you're actually doing, it's not just a barcode on something. The whole tracking system, that's what I think has surprised people with the cost that is entailed there, and then the data systems that they have to have in place to be able to provide drug security for that. But we're seeing people address this address drug security in many ways. It goes from the track and trace of serialization all the way down into inks that are color changing or other security aspects of their packaging. So we've been doing it as an industry for quite a while, but this regulatory setup is kind of what we're just still trying to chase and try to get to the right place.
And what I would say in addition to that, I think a lot of organizations are now realize that it's not a one-stop deal.
Right.
It's a continuous approach. It's a philosophical change within their organization, all the way down from how their operators operate the line, from
Right.
SOP changes to how artwork configuration is going to look, how we're going to deal with different markets. And I think in a long-term approach, how are we going to deal with the data? How is it going to be stored, the integrity behind the data, what are we going to do with the data, how can we use that to benefit us, be more efficient, more effective, and so on and so forth. So I think it's the tentacles, as we've learned and gone through it and done it, realize that this is not a one project and we move on to something. No, it's a continuous effort that we have to kind of monitor and approach and refine and monitor and approach and refine until we get it right.
I think initially people thought it was an equipment issue.
Okay.
it was just going to be a vision system added to a piece of equipment. And what the industry is finding is, of course, it's so much more than that. It's a compliance issue, it's a data issue, it's a reporting issue. It goes all the way through.
That's it. I think one of the things we as an industry have to be aware of, anytime you start talking about data integrity, we got a speaker tomorrow he's ex-FDA, but every year he's been in 2 years now. One of the things that we always touch on is data integrity. And data integrity is like that loose thread on your sweater. So, what Carlos touched on, I mean, if you haven't got it right, the sweater's going. Because that's the first thing an inspector looks at. So, let me ask you this. So, I'm a pharmaceutical company, so should I be focused on serialization, trace requirements? It sounds to me like there's a whole myriad of additional business and trade requirements that I had to be following this year coming up. So, I mean, it sounds to me there's a lot more to it. So, what would be your advice?
I mean, I would say it's all of the above. You have to, you can't look at it through a vacuum. You have to really expand through all aspects of your business, and you touched on it from ink to artwork to SKU management to how am I dealing with my CMOs, how am I dealing with my customer. It's a multi-pronged approach. So I would say it's all of the above. Companies just need to, and I know some of the difficulties with the smaller organizations is they don't have dedicated teams like a Pfizer or a GSK where they can apply 7, 8, 12 resources to attack it and just kind of put them in a silo and let them do it. Others don't have that opportunity, but they need to take the time and find the resources to expand and focus on what they need to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk on size of his organization. I mean, obviously, one of the virtuals there's a lot of CMO activity.
Right.
So if I am going to go, what questions am I going to be asking my CMO? Are they ready? I mean, what's the plan? I mean, people, I think, when I look at the list of standard questions when I go to a CMO for a client, or I go there we go out and look for sourcing support. This isn't one of the top hit parade things. So,
right.
What should I be talking? What should we be talking to CMOs about? What's the plan?
Do they have a plan?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Carlos. First one.
That's the first thing. I mean, when we think about serialization starting to take off in 2008, dealing with many customers as I've gone through this, people learn, and you think by the time we get to 2017, even the smaller organizations have the concepts down, and you'd be surprised. Some of them really don't even know what they need to do,
right,
or how to do it. So there is a large learning curve. So for a customer, they need to be proactive in understanding what serialization needs and not just throw it on the CMO's shoulder. In the same breath, the CMO needs to be proactive in that aspect in understanding what the requirements are. Really what it comes down to is having a plan in place. What does the plan look like? What are you trying to achieve? And who's the best fit to do that? Obviously, I would endorse SeaVision, right, as being the right fit to do that. But it extends down to machine builders and extends down to printer companies.
Yep.
Who are the right players that are going to be successful in delivering your solution, whether manual, semi-automatic, full automatic, or some combination of the three?
To protect the drug supply, we're having to track things like the label integrity. You have to have label control. You have to have packaging control. You have to have the SKU control. You have to have understanding of exactly how these companies are managing this data and what they're doing with it. Asking the simple questions about their quality systems, about label control. How are you managing labels in, labels out, packages in, packages out? How those types of things are done is an important thing. The other thing is that if you start using some of the anti-counterfeit measures that are there, the other thing that you have to start asking is, simple things about your printers. Can your printers even handle some of the ink that I'm planning on using that now my vision system is going to be checking? How are we really going to do this? Have they implemented any other type of electronic batch management that they're using, and how have they handled that data, and what problems have they had? Those types of things will give you some education onto their maturity in handling data.
I'd add just two other points to that. I think one of the other areas is, how are you expecting to communicate interface at the level 4 and level 3? How are you going to move this data around once you've posted the events relative to your batch runs? And I think the other area where organizations lose sight of, the machines cartoners, case packers, bundlers, whatever that may be, they were never intended to be serialized.
Right.
So if you have a small organization who's been running a cartoner for 15 years, A, they generally don't have the capital to go out and spend $500,000 or more on a new machine, and B, they don't think about, can this machine even be retrofitted to account for serialization? So small organizations really need to understand their existing line. Now you get some companies that are basically a table and a conveyor, and they can just put a new manual pack together and serialize that. But understanding your machines and their capabilities to be serialized, and how are you going to interface at level 4 and level 3, even if you have a level 4 communication piece like an ERP in place or MES or something to that effect.
Yeah, from a facility design standpoint, we've seen both very manual systems with people just with guns in their hands where they're tracking things, to all the way to very automated systems where it's, sorry, you're going to have to build a new packaging hall because you're going to have to get new equipment in there. So we've seen it handled both ways, and it affects the facility design dramatically because to be able to provide the type of protection that you need on a manual service is very different than what you would have to do on an automated line that has vision systems.
But, you know, so let me ask you this, so the retrofit, to me, that sounds like, that's gotta be like, is that the major push on most of the small, I mean, are people trying to fix what they got, or they recapitalizing? What's going on?
It varies. It varies from organization to organization. The reality is, if you can retrofit, you're going to retrofit, because that's going to be the leanest approach. It may take a little longer to do your implementation, because retrofitting versus new machine takes longer to get up and running and go live. I think it really is just case by case, depending on how much capital you have available, whether your customer, in some cases, is going to fit part of the bill for your serialization, or they're asking you to own it 100%. Doesn't matter for large organizations. They can do what they want. They have the capital to kind of dictate how they want to make those efforts go forward. But the smaller companies, it's case by case.
So let me ask you this then. Obviously, you know, where's the, obviously industry responds to pressure from regulators, okay? That's key. So let me ask you a simple question. Have you seen any kind of regulatory enforcement? Have they come out? Have people getting gigged on this stuff? I mean, or are we just, as an industry, talking about it in anticipation? So is FDA out there? Are they looking at this stuff? What's the story on that?
So, you know, it's one of those things that we are seeing it. So we are seeing at least the agencies asking companies to plan for it. Now, the dates keep slipping, and we it's almost a joke that every year the date keeps slipping a year. But I think that's really in response to the regulatory seeing that some of the companies are not going to be capable of doing this within the next year, and they're going to need some extra time. But we are seeing the agency come out and say, we do expect to start seeing this. And in lieu of this, until you get to this, we're going to make sure that we increase our scrutiny on the protection of the product that you are doing. And so it's that, that date supposedly is a hard date now, and people are really striving to get there.
Right, I mean, that's November this year, I think is. All right, so let me ask you this. If I'm sitting in the audience and I'm having this epiphany that I haven't done anything yet, what do I do?
Call SeaVision.
Right, shameless plug here.
No, you have to get off your hands. That's the reality. You have to start getting proactive and stop waiting and being reactive. It was fine early on for these small organizations to kind of let the early adopters take the pain and the suffering, the trials and tribulations, but it's vetted out enough to understand what you need to do. For a company, you need to really identify who you're, and I keyed on this before, who are the right people to help you implement it, right? You need a serialization supplier who can deliver in a short time frame. Some of the are my competitors and can do it short. Some can't, depending on your type of complexity. You need to, in some cases, maybe just go with the minimum requirements and scale up after you've gotten that serialized data out and ready, and you've proven that you can serialize for those regulatory compliances.
So one of the things we're suggesting to our clients is exactly what he just said, is you have to get in front of the people that have seen this multiple times. There's not one way of doing this. There's not one flavor. There's a bunch of different flavors of the way you do this. They all come down to the same aspect, but there's several different flavors. So your best bet is to get people in front of you that have seen it in multiple different ways to say, okay, I need to know the 18 different ways that you've seen and that you've implemented it for a company like SeaVision or for any of the other vision system companies or serialization companies, and say, I need help. And so most of the service providers that, so they sell the systems, they're more than just selling the systems. They're helping you design your system. They're helping you to troubleshoot what this is supposed to look like. They're helping you determine what's the best answer for your corporation.
That's a very good point. And from our perspective, our methodology with our customers is partnership. This is not selling you a system and I'm moving on. It's a partnership that we expect to be long-term with you. So we're sitting there at a round table at the initiation phase, at the design review phase, and so on and so forth, at validation, helping customers to understand their needs, what they need to do, what considerations to make, and how it's going to impact their implementation. So it's important. Partnership is important.
Well, let me ask you, if you're, so that I get it, I mean, so Christa, from CRB standpoint, I mean, there's got to be facility questions, equipment questions, and I mean, serialization by itself has to have the other pieces standing behind it. So
it's not a one-legged stool, that's for sure. You have to look at multiple aspects of how it's going to affect the product. Can I actually do some of the things I really need to do? We deal with very complex packaging systems sometimes. And so, if you're going down to the smallest individual unit of sale, which is what you're required to deal with these days. So what does that really mean? And if I have a complex package of a multi-package that goes into one package, what does that mean? Do I have to be able to serialize those two things in? What does it mean for my fold-up package insert? Do I have to serialize that? What do I need? Those types of questions have to be asked and answered on every project, and it has to work into equipment design budgets and layouts. The layouts for these areas, the area gets bigger. The space that you need gets bigger. Now, some products, they're either delicate and you can't just have a machine pick them up and do things with them, or so oftentimes there's variability in the packaging to the point that you're having to do even weight checks at that point to make sure that you've got things appropriately set up for that product to make sure that it gets out right. All of those little aspects affect that layout, affect the facility design, and then it affects how you're handling those labels, and it affects those packages, and affects the SKUs that you're printing on, things like that. You've got to be able to store the ink, the package, the label, all in environmentally controlled areas so that you can protect the integrity of those items.
So, Carlos, you had brought up the Pfizers, the Novartises. I mean, so we're talking about the globalization dimension as well. I mean, what are the other markets? What are the that's got to just lay on even more complexity. I mean, we got the FDA, but you got all these other guys. So where are we at with that? Just to give us a sense of what we're looking at.
So there's two ways of looking at it. You have your facility in Pennsylvania who may serve just one market. So their focus is the U.S. But that same facility, another facility right down the road could serve the U.S., it could serve China, it could be dealing with Saudi Arabia. So now there's multi-layers of complexity. How do I deal with the different markets? How do I incorporate that into my serialization efforts? When we look at the regulations in the EU, or Saudi Arabia, Brazil, China, and so on and so forth, there are a lot of similarities. So you can take from each one of those and understand what you need to do. So I don't find the different markets to be so much of a concern because there's a lot of similarities. And when you have companies like myself and others who have done it, it's kind of a guidance approach, and you can really streamline it. So I don't see that too much of a concern. It's more of the ever-changing regulations that throw the wrench into the equation. Where I think I got my roadmap, they changed the roadmap, and now I have to figure out a new roadmap. Mm-hmm. So that's probably the biggest challenge.
So the repackers, obviously, I mean, this has got to be significant for them. I mean, that's. So I guess there is like. All right, so we got the repackers, we got the global dimension. I think the piece that I still want to drill into a little more is this data security, data exchange. I mean, let's face it, that's usually when FDA comes in. I guarantee, simply based on my own experience, that's what they're going to zero in on because they know that's your Achilles heel. So, I mean, Does that mean that we go to a legacy system? I mean, what happens there, Carla? I mean, what do they ask you to like meld it into what you have? So we'll get two opinions and we'll take Carlos. So what has been your experience so far?
To be quite honest, there's not much of an experience because you're not really required to do anything yet. So I think it's a situation where it's an unknown really at this point.
What would you do? I mean, you're the expert. So if I come to you and I'm clueless, what's going to be your recommendation? I mean, just take a shot.
Are we looking at it from an architectural standpoint? Can you reiterate the question one more time? So
data integrity is an Achilles heel, unquestionable. All right, and that ranges from poor password protection all the way down to the way they do the data entry. Right. So now we're going to be collecting all this information and this data. So what I'm saying is so you got all this serialization. Obviously, we're collecting this information. Where does that go? Does this go into an SAP system that's where I'm at. I mean,
so there's different ways of doing it. So ideally, I would recommend that an organization, if they have the infrastructure, to have an SAP system that they can house that in the cloud, so to speak. But if you don't have that capability, you can clearly just have files, and you can have that data stored in multiple files within a system on a PC in somebody's office if you really need to. So once you have the serialized data and you get it out to the proper regulatory body, you've done your job. You can keep and store that, and you should have that information, but the housing of it is kind of really up to what you want to do. As long as you get it done and it matches what's supposed to be done and get it out to the regulatory body accordingly, I think you're okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the land of big data, there's two real concepts that are out there. Even when you start talking to IT people and things like that, there are really two concepts. There's save everything forever, and there's don't save anything. And we all grew up in save everything forever, and we all kind of have that perspective, and I think the industry has that perspective. Well, I have to have my data stored back to this level, because the minute you start collecting the data, that data is now in play for the regulatory agency to start asking to see that data and wanting to see that data. And if you have anything that goes on, whether it's recalls or whether it's questions about whether that vial that got given to that patient was actually even your vial or not, I think you've got to be able to go back and look at this thing. But the reality in the big data world these days is they're telling people that are not in regulatory agencies and regulatory industries to delete data as fast as possible. It made us wonder. So one of the things that we also do along with our pharmaceutical industry work is data centers, and it made us wonder, wow, are we going to start seeing a bigger growth in data centers just to house pharmaceutical data for this type of thing? Because most of these pharmaceutical companies, they're not usually going to keep it on their software and their hardware. They're going to want that out in data storage that is backed up and backed up and backed up somewhere. All of that has price tags to it, and all of that has infrastructure set up with it. And it's not a simple answer yet.
So a lot of companies have been doing this. They've been piloting the serialization data and exchanges and stuff like that. Did I have that right? I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of what's going on. I mean,
I know one of our clients is just storing it all. And they're storing it all. They have a database. They have a central database that all the data goes back to. And when you ask them, so how big is that database and how long you're going to have to store it, they just kind of, we'll get there.
And where's it going?
Until then, we're just storing it.
And with the intent to do what?
So most of them are used to having to deal with some of the anti-counterfeit measures, and most of them are storing it primarily just to protect themselves from an anti-counterfeit standpoint. If something, and it was fascinating, they sat us down and showed us some of their anti-counterfeit measures, and we all said, yeah, but why? And so their integrity person sat down with us and showed us some of the packaging that goes out, that shows up in other countries that says, this was your product, you poisoned my child. And then they can pull it up and show, wasn't my product, wasn't it. So they've got enough, I don't know if the right word is suspicion, healthy risk aversion, that they're saving those types of data right now. But we haven't gotten a clear answer from just about anyone on how long they're saving it for. Maybe forever, I don't know, until somebody tells them.
It sounds to me like one of the other thing is some guidance that has to be, I mean, obviously it sounds to me like we're kind of like piecing it together as we go. So Carlos, is there a guidance that's out there, or they keep promising and we don't see it? I mean, where are we at?
I don't think there is really any guidance. I think the FDA and others, they're not quite sure. I know they want it, and they feel we all need it, and I think we all agree we should have data integrity. But I don't think there's really a blueprint at this point. I think it's going to be something that's going to have bumps in the road, and there's going to be a feeling out process, and there's going to be mistakes along the way, and then it'll get sorted out,
Right.
whether quickly or not.
So the regulations, I think, are forming right now, but oftentimes the regulatory agencies don't want to be overly prescriptive because technology is changing so fast. And so oftentimes the regulatory agency will wait to see kind of what the first big companies will do to see what the best practices are, and then they're really looking into the industry to develop best practices and move forward with that. So I know ISPE is heavily involved in it, PDA is heavily involved in it, some of the other organizations are heavily involved in it, just to trying to get out there to set some baselines so that regulatory knows what they should ask for, as well as people know what they should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I know this was the same discussion we had around batch, and continuous, and what's, in the end, FDA says, well, you tell us.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's where we're at. So I think with these pilot, with some of the professional organizations putting these things together, I mean, that's where the SUPACs came from. This
Absolutely.
is where a lot of the guidance came from. The guidances. And not only the guidances, the ISP series that puts together. It was the baseline guides.
The baseline guides, right.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're seeing this move. We're seeing this whole data integrity idea move all the way through the industry, and it's always been there in some aspect or another. But as technology is growing and the little devices that we each wear and all that type of thing is growing, it's fascinating to see the things that are developing. Even on the clinical side, what we're talking about is really commercialized drug product. But even on the clinical trial side of things, there are companies developing tracking systems that when those clinical trial materials leave the facility and go out to the patient, there are patient-based and patient-centric tracking systems that are now making sure that when those clinical trials go out, that it's at the right temperature, for the right time, on the right shipping container, all of those types of things. We were talking to a company called Marcan that is doing this right now, and they've got little, to us, it's kind of like process, I'm a process engineer, so gadgets and that type of thing are fascinating to me. And so it's little gadgets that are in your tracking system that can tell you, that can phone back to them and with cellular signal and say, I'm on the shipping dock, they didn't load me into the truck, or hey, I've been out of temperature compliance for 2 minutes, alarm, 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 to go tell somebody to go pick me up and do the right thing with me. From a drug integrity standpoint, that's fascinating because that means we will be getting better even clinical trial data. I've heard complaint after complaint after complaint about clinical trials being having trouble because the product that got out there to the patient was not even in the temperature profile at the right time. It's shocking the things that can happen to product integrity in our industry.
Well, you got to also remember in early stages, the amount of stability data that we have is not as good as it's going to be.
That's right.
3 years down the line. So you kind of, usually you throw caution to the wind and you go cold chain the whole way.
Right.
But you also throw money to the wind.
That's right. So some of these companies are putting the money back into trying to control that and trying to control cold chain and trying to make sure. I've got a friend who is a PharmD pharmacist, and she works in a clinical setting in an inner city. And she says it happens at their clinic all the time where somebody will drop ship, let's just say flu vaccine to the clinic. And it should be in a temperature controlled situation. Well, it was a late pickup. They drop shipped it at 7 o'clock on, September the 29th, and it stayed there all weekend. Now that product's useless. It has to either be shipped back and wasted, Or hopefully the clinicians know enough to say, well, I can't use that. But I think we're starting to see some of the drug efficacy issues based on just simple little things like that. So companies are trying to take hold of it and control it to be able to say, okay, Mr. Cold Chain Supplier or Mr. Shipper, I told you to keep it at this temperature. You now owe me money back because you destroyed my product.
I gotta, having been in development and manufacturing for many years, I couldn't tell you how many batches of API that we shipped to a, shall we say, in remote location for processing, and it's garbage by the time we get
Right.
it. I want to thank Carlos and Christa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Y'all have a great show today.
You too.
Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with Interfex 2017, presents Interfex Live.